Thank you very much for inviting me to this event, this very impressive audience, and also joining a great lineup of speakers today. So I join you from Oxfam, which is an international NGO working in more than 90 countries around the world to fight poverty and injustice. I'm based at our UK head office, but we've also got some colleagues here from Oxfam in Sweden that have joined us today. Now, a couple of years ago, Oxfam launched a confederation-wide campaign against inequality. So I'm going to share with you this morning some of the trends, the causes, the consequences, and the solutions that are concerning us. And hopefully this is going to provide a good global perspective on what you'll be talking about for the next couple of days. And as a researcher, I'll also end with some of the research questions that are continuing to puzzle us as we go forward and we continue to work on this campaign against inequality. So to start, 2 years ago, we published a paper which had the following headline statistic, that 85 of the richest people had the same amount of wealth as 3.5 billion people in the planet. Now, this was shocking. We did this by looking at two main data sources. Credit Suisse published data on wealth, not only average wealth by country, but it also looked at wealth across the country. How much wealth do people in the poorest parts of the country own versus how much those at the richest ends own. Credit Suisse used this data in order to map a global distribution. And when you look at wealth globally, you see that at the very richest end, the richest 1% on the planet, 75% of those people live in North America and Europe. Each of them have at least $750,000 US worth of net worth. At the other end of the distribution, the poorest 50%, 4 out of 5 of those people live in some of the poorest countries in Africa and in Asia. These people have an average of less than $500 US. We compared this global wealth distribution against the Forbes list of billionaires. This creates a sum for each of the richest individuals living in the world. The wealth of these individuals is massive, and it changes daily. Now, this year, Forbes have started calculating how much these individuals own on a daily basis. Indeed, I checked this morning, and Carlos Slim made $750 million overnight in the last 24 hours. So what we did is we took this list of billionaires and we counted down. We added up how much their cumulative wealth was worth. And we only needed to get to number 85. By the time we got to 85 billionaires, the amount of wealth was $1.7 trillion US, which was the same amount as the bottom half of the planet. The next year, we looked at the data again. And the wealthy had just got wealthier. It took then just 80 billionaires to have the same amount of wealth as the bottom half of the planet. What we were seeing was not just an extreme level of inequality, which made no economic or moral sense, but also a trend towards increasing wealth inequality. We looked at the share of wealth that was owned by the richest 1% of people. And we saw that they were increasing their share of total wealth. Year on year, the amount of wealth that the richest 1% owned was going up. We projected forward. We projected that by 2016, if trends continued, the richest 1% of people would have more wealth than the rest of the world put together. But in fact, we were wrong, because that happened a year earlier. That happened in 2015. Already, the richest 1% of people have more wealth than everyone else put together. And so to this year, to January 2016, again, we did the calculations, and again it's got worse. 62 individuals now have the same amount of wealth as the bottom half of the planet. Those 62 individuals have made more than $1 trillion US since 2010, whilst the wealth of the poorest 50% has actually declined. Now why? Why am I talking about billionaires? Why does Oxfam, an organization that's working to fight poverty and injustice, why are we worried about the wealthy? Well, it's because we all live in the same system. We all live within the same planetary boundaries. We live within the same countries, with the same governments and policies. We work in the same markets. And unless we really understand where power and where prosperity is being made and gained and captured, then we'll fail to fight poverty and injustice. But let's put this in perspective, because the number of people living in extreme poverty around the world has fallen quite dramatically. The people living on less than $1.90 a day fell from 37% in 1990 to 16% in 2010, a halving of the proportion of people living in extreme poverty 5 years before the MDG target. Indeed, the World Bank estimate that in 2015, the proportion of people living below that extreme poverty line is less than 10%. In September last year, at the UN General Assembly, the world's leaders agreed a commitment to eradicate extreme poverty by 2030. And based on trends, this is a worthy goal to have. However, the World Bank themselves have projected forward. And based on already quite optimistic growth rates, they've predicted that we will fail to achieve this target. We won't eradicate poverty by 2030 unless the distribution of income changes and people at the poorest part of the income distribution see a better share, a greater share of income gains. A key example of this is Zambia, a country which has grown strongly. From 1990 to 2010, growth rates have averaged between 6% and 8%. However, also during that period, the number of people living in extreme poverty has doubled, where in 1990 there were 4.5 million people living below $1.90 a day, there are now 9 million. It's clear that you can grow, but unless you share that growth fairly, you'll fail to reduce poverty. Now, we wanted to understand the distribution of income more fully. So we took some data from the World Income Distribution Dataset compiled by Branko Milanovic and Christoph Lachner. And similar to the wealth data, we have incomes not just at the national level, but within the country, looking at the incomes earned by the poorest to the richest deciles in each country. We then used that to map our own global distribution. And in the poorest deciles of the planet, we see that people are on very low incomes. The poorest 2 deciles, the poorest 20%, are those people living on or near the extreme poverty line. The richest 10% are those people that you would expect, people that are living in rich countries, people in Europe and people in North America. And when we look at the overall picture, there's a positive story. The economy grew. People at the poorest parts of the distribution saw their incomes rise. These are all positive bars on the charts. And as I said, this helped millions of people escape extreme poverty. But you can also see that the richest people, people already with the highest incomes, saw a much greater share of total income growth. And this is over the period 1988 to 2011. The poorest 20%, those people that need the increase, the boost to their incomes the most, saw less than 2% of total income growth over this period. And what's also striking is that we know that this data underrepresents what's happening at the very top of the distribution. This data is based on household surveys, which is well known to underrepresent those with the very highest incomes. So in reality, what we would expect to see is a much taller bar at the far end of this chart. Now, this story of economic inequality, is not just important for poor people living in poor countries. We also know that economic inequality is a phenomenon we're seeing in rich countries too. In fact, in Europe, what we're seeing is that the richest 1% of people have 40% of the total wealth. Across OECD countries, the richest 10% of people earn 9 times more than the poorest 20%. And this is up from 7 times more 20 years ago. Sweden, a country well recognized to be one of the more equal countries in the world. There are 23 billionaires in 2015, a total net worth of $115 billion US, which is the same amount of wealth as the bottom 50% of the population. For incomes, the top incomes distribution database shows that the richest 1% of people have seen their share of total income almost double between 1990 and 2013. But we're interested in economic inequality, not just because of its effect on incomes, but because we also know that it's highly correlated with really important social outcomes too. This is a data set from the DHS survey in Ethiopia of 2011, which shows that wealthy women are 3 times more likely than poor women to attend school. There's a clear difference whether or not you've got money of whether or not you'll get a decent education. But the reason I put this up is also because it highlights that economic inequalities intersect and compound with other inequalities like gender. And that's especially important to recognize today on International Women's Day, that these mutually reinforcing inequalities can really hurt the most marginalized people in multiple ways. Now, there's these outcomes, the social outcomes, health and education, social cohesion, safety, even happiness. All of these things have been found in research to relate very closely to the level of economic inequality. But even if you don't care about any of those things, even if you're still staunchly convinced that for us as Oxfam, we should just focus on growth because growth is the answer to poverty reduction, well, even the IMF and the OECD have found that growth itself and the stability and longevity of growth is highly related to the levels of inequality. So there seems so much compelling evidence that as to why we should really be concerned about the level of economic inequality we've seen, and therefore, that's why we've launched a campaign to fight it. Now, another really important aspect is not just about economic outcomes, but indeed about political power and voice. Our report from 2014, Working for the Few, showed that it's not only wealth in terms of money that's important, but that wealth gives you power. It gives you power and influence over the policies and the institutions that affect us all. And people without power, without voice, are those that are left behind. So let's start to get into a little bit more of some of the causes of this level of economic inequality we've seen. And we know that some of it is driven by the economy and by the labour market. As Thomas Piketty famously found, the rate of R is greater than the rate of G, that capital is really growing faster than the rest of the economy. The return on capital is growing faster than the rest of the economy, which means that the labour share of income is declining. That's the proportion of income growth that goes to ordinary workers. But even within that wage share, within that labour share, the difference between wages is growing. This is data from Mitchell and Davis of the Economic Policy Institute, which shows that CEO pay is 1,000 times greater today than it was in the 1980s. And it is not only grown faster than the value of the companies in which these CEOs are running, but has way outstripped the average growth of wages of the ordinary worker, which have remained stagnant over this period. So some people are making money, but for the majority, workers are not. And we also see this in supply chains. A lot of our work working in developing countries with a large number of people working on poverty wages, particularly in the garment sector, shows that wages have in fact fallen in many countries in real terms. And this is at the same time that the companies that they work for higher up the supply chain have indeed made extraordinary profits. Stefan Persson, for example, of H&M, one of the billionaires in R62, is now worth $21 billion. The bargaining power of workers, which was also mentioned earlier in the preceding presentation, is something that we're particularly concerned by. People that are seeing their wages stagnate or even decline in real terms clearly are not using the bargaining power that people once had. Indeed, again, in Sweden, the density of people working with unions, the union density in Sweden has fallen from 80% to 68% over the last 30 years. Within the economies, we're also seeing regulatory environments and systems and structures that are enabling people, companies, and individuals to make extraordinary profits without developing any real value add to society. I've picked a couple of examples to make this point. Last year, you might remember that there was a drug that was 62 years old into its patent. It was bought by a former hedge fund manager who immediately increased the price from $13.50 to $750. Now, there was no added value from that transaction, but there was extraordinary profits to be made from that price hike. Now, the astonishing thing to me is not that that happened, but that's completely legal. The second example, again, which was mentioned earlier, is in the financial sector. The profits and the pay and the bonuses that were made by people working in the financial sector in the run-up to the global financial crisis were extraordinary. And as we saw post-2008, these were far from adding value to our society, but in fact created the environment that was incredibly destructive and, again, hurt the poorest people most. Now, government policies can be incredibly powerful at attenuating the level of economic inequality. And indeed, Sweden, again, here is a very good example, where you see, before taxes and transfers, the green bars on the chart, Sweden has a relatively high level of income inequality compared to other European Union countries. But through taxes and transfers, it manages to bring down that level of economic inequality quite dramatically. Indeed, when you compare it to a country like Italy, which starts from a lower level, but does a lot less through its taxes and transfers to even things out. So we know that taxes and transfers, public spending, taxes that are very progressive, can do a lot to make our societies fairer. However, what we also know is that we're massively hampered by the international financial architecture that lets people avoid paying the taxes that they owe. Indeed, it's estimated that about $7.6 trillion of individual wealth is stashed in tax havens. If that was actually taxed, if it was put in the countries where it was generating income and paying the taxes at the rate that it should be, it could create an additional $190 billion worth of essential revenues. And this is just individuals' wealth. We also know that companies are actively and aggressively using tax havens and various tax avoidance and tax evasion strategies. From Amazon to Google, not a day goes by when there's not another scandal that breaks. And this costs countries rich and poor. It's estimated by the IMF that tax avoidance tactics by companies is costing developing countries $100 billion every year. And it's not just Oxfam that sees economic inequality as a challenge and something that needs to be addressed. From Obama to Jim Kim at the World Bank, it's well recognized that the levels of inequality we're seeing and the trends at which the gap between the rich and the poor is growing is something that needs to be addressed as a matter of urgency. However, rhetoric is one thing, statements and speeches is one thing, but we need actions and we actually need policies, some of which will be incredibly unpopular with the vested interests and the powerful people with wealth, with income, that sit in the very highest positions. We need actions on minimum wages, on bargaining power within the workforce, on pay ratios between CEOs and the average worker. We need better regulation to avoid things like the financial crisis, where the financial sector was just allowed to run wild. We need progressive spending on health and education, not just spending on health, but progressive spending on health. And we need taxes that tax those that can afford it most more than those that can least afford it. But to be able to actually have a progressive tax system, critically, we need to close those tax loopholes and end the era of tax havens, a preserve of the wealthy and the companies that are deliberately looking to avoid paying the taxes they owe in a way that we, the rest of us, aren't able to. But far from pretend that every country is the same and that this picture of inequality looks exactly the same wherever you live, and that we have all the answers and that we know all the policy prescriptions from tax policy to spending policies to regulation of the financial sector, Indeed, as a researcher, I like to keep myself busy, so we're continuing to ask lots of questions. We want to understand more how better to increase the bargaining power of workers. As unions decrease in their power and their population, what is it that's going to enable people to stand up for their rights in the workplace and not face the same pressures from further up the supply chain in particular? We also want to link our work on inequality much more closely with our work on climate change. Last year, we published a report which found that the richest 10% of people are responsible for more than 50% of CO2 emissions. So those richest people are responsible for a large share, more than half of total emissions, and yet it's the poorest people that face the highest cost as a result of climate change. This is a global inequality and injustice on a massive scale that's also increasing over time. Finally, we also want to look much more closely about how to influence policies. Now, this is something that we've always been conscious of, working as an NGO in more than 90 countries around the world, facing pressure as an international NGO with the closing space for civil society in many of the countries we operate in, including, for example, in the UK, where researchers like myself are being told not to advocate for anything. Forbid that my research should influence any policies. So we're conscious that we want to have influence, and at the moment, what we're faced with is massive challenges to rebalance the influence over the policies that are currently captured by those at the very top of the distribution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deborah. I was just wondering, I know Forbes, they released their list of the most rich people in the world just a week ago or something, and Bill Gates is at the top. Did he react to this? To your paper that was published?
Well, I think Bill Gates has never said anything directly to Oxfam about it, but his perspective is always that wealthy people do good, and that's true. Many of those people on the Forbes list of billionaires are huge philanthropists, donating a lot of money to health and education and developing countries. But from our perspective, that's not good enough, because they retain the power. They've got the power over health policy in developing countries in the end. And it's much better that the economy, if you like, does more of the redistribution, that it's not up to those wealthy individuals to be philanthropists. I would never try and stop them. I think it's great what they do. But it would be much better if instead, further down the supply chain, Microsoft were paying its workers in developing countries a far higher wage, and that people were earning their way up rather than depending on philanthropic donations.
And the most obvious you mentioned it yourself already, but the most obvious critique you had after this report was published was, of course, the question of raising taxes in correlation to economic growth and how that will work, and that a lot of money also creates growth. This tax system, is it only the rich people that should be taxed? How specific are you in your arguing?
Well, actually, the main ask we've come out with this year is not to change the tax system per se, but to close the loopholes. So we'll get to the tax system, and yes, we should be definitely introducing more direct taxes, as opposed to VAT, for example, which hurts the poorest people most. But beyond looking at the details of tax, which is very complicated and dependent on the structure of your economy and your demographics, it's a complete injustice that some people pay no taxes, that Warren Buffett has openly said that he pays a much lower tax rate than his cleaner does, because he's able to use tax avoidance tactics, because tax havens exist that legally allow people to avoid paying the taxes they owe.
I would say that for Sweden, it's not very usual that our NGOs go out and argue as politically as you do in this very moment. What reactions did you get?
Well, definitely there is a kind of, especially in the UK, some pushback against us being political. But essentially, as I described, our interests are in ensuring that the policies that are put in place protect the poorest people, and that poverty and injustice is fought. And you can't do that from just looking at half the picture. Because where policies are made are in those spheres of influence. So it's part of our responsibility to look there. It's part of our responsibility to fight inequality, because otherwise we can't do our jobs properly.
What next research would you like to make in this area, just to find the right
I think
facts?
jobs is a critical one, because whilst taxes and transfers have an incredibly important role to play, we need the economy to do more of the heavy lifting. We need people to have decent, well-paid jobs that make them feel fulfilled and empowered, not just receiving social welfare benefits that enable them to live a very basic standard of life. So that's going to be our research that I'll be focusing on for the next couple of years, really looking at how to create decent jobs where workers feel empowered.
Good luck, and thank you very much for being here today. Deborah Hardoon, Oxfam.